This book's cradle was another America.
Also, Pacific Northwest authors discuss their books and take your calls. Book TV, live from Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon, February 27th and 28th, here on C-SPAN 2. Every weekend, C-SPAN 2 brings you Book TV, 48 hours of books, authors, and the publishing industry. C-SPAN 2, created by the cable television industry and offered to you as a public service by your local cable company. Neil Baldwin is the author of this book, Legends of the Plumed Serpent. It's a biography of 5,000 years of the Mexican god pictured on the book's cover, known as the Plumed Serpent because it resembles a bird and a snake. The book is reviewed in this weekend's New York Times Book Review. Next, the author discusses how he came to write the book and the Plumed Serpent's impact on Latin American culture. Mr. Baldwin spoke at the Mexican Cultural Institute in Washington, D.C.
Hello. Good evening. Let me first of all introduce myself. My name is not as difficult to pronounce as Quetzalcoatl, but it's also a bit difficult, at least a family name. My name is Álvaro Rodríguez Tirado, and I am the Minister of Cultural Affairs at the Mexican Embassy and the Director of the Mexican Cultural Institute. Let me welcome you all to this lovely mansion. And since apparently I see lots of new faces here, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here. And apparently there is an interest to know more about this house. Let me tell you what I know about it. This house was built back in 1910. Mrs. Emily McVeigh had it built as a birthday present for her husband, Mr. Franklin McVeigh. The lucky husband was the Secretary of the Treasury under President Taft administration. And the story goes that Franklin McVeigh will drive down 16th Street to wherever his office was at the time, and he kept on wondering what in the hell were they building here, and no one was to tell him. And on his birthday, Mrs. McVeigh claimed to have a terrible headache and asked him to take her out for a walk. And so he did, and when they were passing in front of his house, she just said, "Stop here, let me present you with the birthday present that I have in store for you," and she handed him the keys. So what we do, or at least what I did when I was appointed here, the director of this institution, the first thing that I did was to bring my wife around and tell her the story, but to no effect whatsoever. The house, the McVeighs moved into the house, and they lived here for 5 years, a period of almost 5 years. And then Mrs. Emily McVeigh died, and Mr. McVeigh just found the whole thing too sad, and so he decided to move out of the house. And then Mr. McVeigh rented the house to the American government, and it became a sort of Blair house, you know, the house for distinguished guests and heads of state. And it went on being a Blair house for something like 3, 4, 5 years, more or less. Then in the 1920s, the Mexican government bought the house, and ever since it became both the residence of the Mexican ambassador as well as the site of the Mexican embassy. And it went on being the site of the Mexican embassy until 1989, 1990, that was 8 years ago, when the embassy moved out to Pennsylvania Avenue, where it now is, 1911 Pennsylvania Avenue. And the Mexican government decided to keep this lovely mansion, but to give it a different purpose. And so it became the Mexican Cultural Institute, which is an institution dedicated in its entirety to the promotion of Mexican culture and Mexican art. Our pledge with Mr. McVeigh was that we were not going to be doing any remodeling to the house, which, as you can see, is like it has a certain meshing of different styles, you know, an Italian facade and French rooms and so on. And our pledge was to be taken until he died. When he died, we decided to bring Roberto Cueva del Rio, who was a rather not very well known, but more or less well-known Mexican painter that did some work under Diego Rivera whilst Diego was doing his work at the Ministry of Education in Mexico City. So Roberto Cueva del Rio came to live here in Washington, and he painted the murals in the 1930s. He started painting them in 1933, and it took him something like 7 to 8 years until he finished the murals. As you can see, the interesting thing about the murals is that, by contrast to the murals of Rivera, Orozco, or Siqueiros, these murals carry no ideological message whatsoever. They tell you more about our festivities, you know, how colorful they all are, and certainly about the hemispheric relations. And so I think they're pretty lovely, and in a way they mesh nicely into the different styles that are prevail here at this mansion. This music room where we all are now is supposed to be a replica of one of the Fontainebleau Castle's music rooms. And it has a lovely, lovely acoustics, which obviously you cannot see now because of the mic, but because of the curvature of its ceiling and so on, the acoustics are are fantastic. Anyway, that's about what I'm going to tell you about the house. We have some brochures of the house if you're interested in getting one, with some pictures of these reception rooms. We have 2 galleries, one gallery on the ground floor, which we call the José Clemente Orozco Gallery, and one gallery on the 4th floor, which we call the Frida Kahlo Gallery. They both have now the work of Jeffrey Holder, which, by the way, is the first time that the Mexican Cultural Institute opens the doors to a non-Mexican artist. On the Auditorium Benito Juárez, which is on the ground floor at the end of a corridor and you make a right, the Auditorium Benito Juárez holds now an exhibit of the Ibero-American Art Salon. That's a collection of watercolors from 20 different countries, all of Latin America and Spain. No Portugal, but Spain is included. Okay. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Neil Baldwin, who will be talking to us about his new book, Legends of the Plumed Serpent, Biography of a Mexican God. By way of introduction, let me just say a few words about the topic of tonight's lecture and make some brief comments about the illustrious background of Mr. Neil Baldwin. Quetzalcoatl is, without any doubt, a god, a Mexican god, if you like it, as the title of our book reminds us. It is funny to think of a god as having a certain nationality, but there it is. Quetzalcoatl, though, is more than a god. More than a god. What more can one be? But anyway, what I have in mind is that the word Quetzalcoatl refers more to a category of different things. That is to say, under the scope of such a concept fall not only gods or a god, but also heroes, priests, and kings. This is because the concept Quetzalcoatl crosses the boundaries of a single culture or civilization, and there are important changes of meaning that such concept undergoes, spanning as it does cultures as the Olmec, the Toltec, the Maya, and the Aztecs. It is these different meanings, I imagine, that will occupy Mr. Baldwin in what follows. Be that as it may, there is no doubt that for 5,000 years, the image and myth of Quetzalcoatl, our morning and evening star, has remained the most pervasive and protean archetype in Mesoamerican history. Such a wonderful subject is the topic of Neil Baldwin's new book. Allow me now to say something about the author. Dr. Neil Baldwin was born in New York City and received his BA in English from the University of Rochester and his PhD in Modern American Poetry from the State University of New York at Buffalo. He has taught literature and creative writing at many colleges and universities, including the City College of New York, Hunter College, Baruch College, and many others. He has worked in the nonprofit literary field for the past 2 decades, most recently at the New York Public Library, where he was manager of the annual fund and then co-director of the campaign for the library. Since 1989, he has been the executive director of the National Book Foundation, sponsor of the prestigious National Book Awards and educational outreach efforts across America. Dr. Baldwin is the author of several volumes of poetry, 3 textbooks, and 3 biographies. To All Gentleness, William Carlos Williams, the Doctor Poet; Man Ray, American artist, and Edison, Inventing the Century. His book, Legends of the Plumed Serpent, was published last October and was named one of the best books of 1998 by Publishers Weekly magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall leave the floor now to Mr. Neil Baldwin.
Thank you very much for that very erudite introduction, and thank you for being so patient and waiting for the appropriate moment. And I must say I'm very honored, very, very honored to be here in this beautiful, beautiful house. I just want to say a couple of words about why I chose this subject before we begin very quickly to show the slides and to talk about the imagery. I originally was going to call this the biography of a myth. I've written biographies of major historical figures, authors, artists, inventors, and I reached a point where I wanted to return to my very earliest interest, intellectual interest, which is poetry and archetype and myth and the roots of all cultures. And I mean, that sounds rather presumptuous, but that's what I wanted to do, because I'd reached a point where I wanted to explore the chronology of a myth as if it were a person. And I felt that the myth has a life cycle: gestation, birth, growing up, adolescence, adulthood, decline, death, and rebirth, which is very, very important, especially to Quetzalcoatl. So, although I am known and have spent the last half of my life writing biographies of people, in a way this is a logical extension of my work, and it certainly allowed me to become more familiar with Mexico, which was one of the most important things that has happened to me in the past decade. So, can we turn down some of the lights so we can see the slides, and then we will start the show. Oh, could someone turn the slide projector on? That would really help. Okay. Great. Now, of course, now I can't see my notes, but that's good. That's good, because I like to improvise. I like to be more flexible. Oh, now I really can't see anything. Okay. I'm starting with a picture of a sprout of corn, the corn plant, the maize plant, because I feel that the story of Quetzalcoatl, plumed serpent, really begins with corn, maize, which is the source of all life. And the sprout of the maize plant is the symbol of the tongue of the serpent, the earth serpent, penetrating upward from the ground. And as we proceed with this story, you're going to see this image repeated in many different varieties, and you just have to hold it in your mind, because I very strongly feel that to go back to what I call the time before time, that's where the maize plant begins. This is our friend, the Quetzal bird. Quetzal, the bird, and Coatl, the snake. Those are the two parts of his identity. And I wanted you to have an image of the Quetzal bird, which is in terms of it's a threatened species. It is not an endangered species. It's one level before that. So it's definitely fading from view, but the Quetzal bird lives, his natural habitat is about 150 feet up in the trees in the cloud forests of Central America. And this picture was taken, the photographer for National Geographic who took this picture built himself a treehouse and sat there for a week until the Quetzal finally appeared. In the ancient Maya society, the bird would be captured and his tail would be clipped off and used for ceremonial dress and headdresses and so forth. But then he would be released back into the wild. It was considered to be a very grievous offense to kill a Quetzal bird, a sacred bird. Now, in the ancient codices, the books of the Aztec people, there are many depictions of the Quetzalcoatl in his different identities, and I want to just show you him as a snake that is definitely flying through the air. And you can see in the top picture what looks like feathers or plumes emanating from his back. But the first real engraved image of plumed serpent is felt to be from the Olmec culture. The Olmec, as many of you know, I'm sure, is the mother culture of Mexico, the root culture that the others succeeding it emanate from. And this slab was found near Veracruz in about 1955 when the airstrip was being built there. And it's thought to be dated from about between 1500 and 1000 years before Christ. And you see the serpent is sort of embracing the priest. And the priest, we know he's a priest because he's holding in his right hand the copal, the incense pouch, which was his privilege. And you can see above his headdress, I'm going to try to point it out to you without, there, you can see there's two Quetzal birds face to face, right over here. So the serpent has his headdress, which is thought to possibly be a plume shape. The important thing, though, is to notice that he seems to be cradled or perhaps even being put forth into the world by the serpent, and that sort of carries through into the major Olmec belief that the human race and the animal race, as it were, are equals and are equal in the sense of they're inhabiting the earth on the same plane. And when the priest, the Olmec priest, was in a spiritual state, he would begin to merge with the animal world, and the animal world would merge with the human world. This is the man-jaguar of the Olmec. You see the crouching position in which he is, which is a sign of his being in a praying mode. And the priest was felt to be in touch more closely with the animal spirit world when he was intoxicated while he was in his spiritual mode. So the Quetzalcoatl, as we heard in the introduction, the Quetzalcoatl does have its human identity, and this is kind of a precursor of that. In the caves this is from Chalcatzingo, which is in Olmec, is in the southwestern Olmec region, and I'm showing this to you because, again, you see the serpent almost as if it were embracing the man, and you see the very familiar image of the split tongue that I told you about. And the priest seated within the embrace of the serpent, sort of surrounding him on all sides. So you're beginning to see a sense in which the serpent and the man are coming together. Oh, great. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Too bright. Now, at Teotihuacan, which I'm sure many of you have visited, which is to me the most, of all the ruins and all the sacred archaeological sites that I visited in Mexico, my personal favorite, I'm sure everybody has one, is Teotihuacan, which is a huge complex about 30 miles north of Mexico City. And the interesting thing about Teotihuacan in relation to the plumed serpent is that there are no depictions of human beings anywhere in Teotihuacan. All the murals are of animals, and most of them are plumed. There are plumed butterflies, quetzal butterflies, there are plumed serpents, and this is a plumed jaguar. And this mural, to me, is, again, another symbol of the power of the plumage in the symbolism of this culture, which reaches its epitome in the Temple of the Plumed Serpent at Teotihuacan, which is actually the last building to be built at this site. It dates to about 250 AD, and I took this picture. Notice how I subtly credited myself with the picture. I took this picture about 8 o'clock in the morning. I tried to get to the site before the buses arrive. At about 10 or 10:30, all the buses come up from Mexico City, and the place becomes very crowded, and it's hard to get the feeling, the quiet and peaceful feeling. So the sun was just coming up over the top of the building, and let's just zoom in on the major head of Quetzalcoatl. And I want you to take a close look at the nature of the plumes surrounding his head. Because remember, we talked about the maize plant, we talked about the fact that we have to trace it back to an agricultural society. These ears of maize, these illustrations from the Codex Florentino, show the head, as it were, surrounded by the leafy husk of corn. And I think it's not stretching it too much to see that there is definitely a relationship. When you move on to Tula, which is east of Mexico City, to the next major culture in Mexico, and you find the first really freestanding representations of Quetzalcoatl in its earthly, starting to become more of an earthly role as a king, or as a god that came to earth and became a king. And these statues are about 12 feet high, and they weigh about 2 tons, and they're at the top of a step temple, and they're not totally visible from the ground. So you sort of walk up the steps, and all of a sudden they appear in front of you, and it's quite a spectacular sight. Again, near Tula, there's a cave engraving which I wanted to share with you, which you can see parts of it have been obliterated by the elements, but now you see the human qualities are emerging more in the Quetzalcoatl image. His feet at the bottom, and his plumed tail and headdress, and over on the far right-hand side, there's the serpent's tongue again that we saw at the very beginning. Now, in the codices, the books, before the Spanish arrived, and we'll be talking about that soon, before the conquistadors arrived, of course, all of the books were pictographic. That is, they were, the language and the stories were told in illustrations, in picture form only. And this picture of Quetzalcoatl, which resembles the picture we just saw from the cave, you see him holding, it looks like a little baby he's holding in his right hand, but in fact, that is Quetzalcoatl bringing mankind to earth, because that was his major role as the life bringer, the life giver. And underneath in the writing, you see the second word from the left you can see is Quetzalcoatl right here. So what happened was, this is jumping ahead a little tiny bit in our story, but, well, actually about 500 years, but when the Spanish missionaries, the Dominicans and Franciscans, came, and the Jesuits late were the last to come, and they began to speak to the native people and learn their own language and try to write down their history, to translate, as it were, the pictures of their history. So the writing underneath is the transcription of the interviews and the oral histories that were taken by the native people, in this case the Aztecs. So they're sort of like, if you will, they're sort of like captions for the pictures that pre-existed them. But we'll be getting back to that soon. So in my next step in my journey, we're sort of gradually moving in an easterly direction. Those of you who know Mexico, we're now getting toward the Oaxaca, toward the Zapotec and Mixtec civilizations. And in this culture, we have the god called Cosijo, and Cosijo means lightning. And at Monte Alban, which is the major ceremonial center near Oaxaca, this statue is located in a kind of, it's like a man-made cave down. You have to, they slide this covering off on the ground, and you go down several steps. It's very, very dark, so the guide has to hold up a mirror, which is very symbolic right there, to catch the sunlight, and then he gets the reflection of the sun to reflect down into the cave there, and then you take the picture if you catch it right. So you can see Cosijo has the same qualities in terms of his combination of human qualities and animal qualities as Quetzalcoatl, and his hands are shaped in that way because he brought lightning and rain, and in that same way is related to the function of Quetzalcoatl as in terms of the harvest and growth and life. Now, about 75 years ago, when this picture was taken, D.H. Lawrence, the great English novelist, was visiting Mitla, which is a ruin, not actually a ruin, it's more of a ceremonial site, further to the east, away from Mitla, away from Oaxaca, going in an easterly direction. And the thing about Mitla that I want to bring to your attention is that the entire temple complex is now viewed as a tribute to the Quetzalcoatl story, to the story of the serpent and the story of Quetzalcoatl going down into the underworld to rescue the bones of his ancestors. So I decided I was going to try to find the exact spot where D.H. Lawrence, he's the second from the left without the hat, right here. So I went back to Mitla and I stood in the same spot, closer up so you could really see the incredible work that went into this. This mosaic was done entirely with stone tools. There were no metal tools, and each of these pieces was put in by hand into a stucco wall, and then the stucco dried, and they holds the mosaic there. And Miguel Covarrubias, who was a very important Mexican artist and writer and historian and just a very multi-talented person, he was the first person to notice the similarity between these shapes and the tongue of the serpent. And he was the first to point out that in some way the entire complex of Mitla is a tribute to the serpent. Now the books of the Zapotec people and Mixtec people were of a different style, as you can see, than the Aztec codex we saw before. And the depiction of the Quetzalcoatl is more embracing of the entire world that these people lived in. You can see here the human quality and the plumage again, starting out on this side and going all the way down the bottom, and up the left-hand side you see the jaws. And the feeling is that this shows how Quetzalcoatl's power embraced the entire knowable world. Whereas at Chichen Itza, before it was excavated, Chichen Itza in 1860, when it was first photographed by Désiré Charnay, who was a French expeditionary photographer, this is the temple of Kukulkan. Kukulkan is Mayan language for Quetzalcoatl. So now we're all the way over to the far eastern region, the Yucatan Peninsula, and that's the site of course, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Tikal, and many of the other important ceremonial centers. But this temple, before it was excavated, and then, of course, the site that many people know most familiarly, the actual temple of Kukulkan, or Plume Serpent. This entire temple is consecrated to the Plume Serpent. And when the Toltec migration from the western Mexico region came across to the Yucatan, the architectural details changed and became hardened and more clarified and more aggressive looking. But the interesting thing about this temple, as some of you may know, is that at the solstice, the summer solstice, when the sun rises over this sector here, it casts a shadow, a sinuous shadow in the shape of a snake going all the way down the side of the temple and ending up, you can't see very well, those are two huge, gigantic snake heads carved out of one boulder. And so the entire temple becomes one tribute to the image of the Plume Serpent. It's 364 steps plus the top flat platform makes 365. So it's oriented toward the points of the compass. Over at the ball court in Chichen Itza, when I was walking around, I found this stela which attracted my attention because it reminded me of the diving god at Tulum. It reminded me of the identity of Plume Serpent in his airborne role, because it seemed as if this very sad-faced, sort of melancholy god was just coming down for a landing. He was crouching down, and you can see the serpent's tongue again. And the feathers. It just struck me that there was so much iconography there, not just in the major temples that everybody looks at, but off in the side and down paths and in areas where lots of people don't necessarily go. And meanwhile, at Uxmal, you remember we talked about the way the priestly identity was harbored or embraced by the snake. And this actually is in the museum in Mexico City, the Anthropological Museum in Mexico City, which is a magnificent place to start one's journey. And you see how the priest is embraced in the serpent's jaws. Again, this sense of the serpent embracing man. Now, before we move into our sort of third phase, yes, I heard someone say tears. This is the weeping god. This is Quetzalcoatl as in his guise as the weeping god. And the reason he was called the weeping god was because of his tragic fate which befell him after he had brought his people, the Toltecs, to a certain level of idealized civilization and culture and agriculture and the arts and dance and literature, and had built them up to a very highly civilized level. And then he was tricked by his evil twin. Every hero has an evil twin, I think, of some kind. Tezcatlipoca, excuse me, and he intoxicated Quetzalcoatl, and in his state of drunkenness, he slept with his own sister. And so he was cast out from the city in a state of transgression. And he vowed one day he would return to save his people. And that is going to lead us into the next sort of ironic phase of the story, because the return of Quetzalcoatl is where the irony of the story comes into play. When the Aztec people finished their hundreds of years of wandering and migration in the northwestern parts of regions of Mexico, from where it is thought they originally emanated, from the caves and from the island of Aztlan, the reason they knew where to establish their city, Tenochtitlan, was they came upon an eagle perched upon a cactus, and the eagle had a serpent in his mouth, Quetzalcoatl again. And the gods told them this was the place where they should build their city, that their wanderings had finally come to an end. They had finally found their home. So that is how the Aztecs founded their city, on the basis of the image of Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs really took the plumed serpent to its most dramatic form. And now we're at a point just before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century. And these next three sculptures are all Aztec portrayals of Quetzalcoatl. This one was taken in an exhibition that I went to in Mexico City. It was in the College of San Ildefonso, and there was a big sign. I shouldn't probably say this in the Mexican Cultural Institute, but oh well. There was a big sign, no tocar, you're not supposed to take pictures, and I saw this, the lighting was so dramatic. So I waited until the guard was they sort of walk slowly from one room to another room, so I just took this one picture. This is the only time I did that, okay? I confess. This is in the collection of the Vatican Museum in Rome. You see the incredible power of the serpent with the feathers wrapped around him. And this one is in the Philadelphia Museum, in the Arensberg collection. It's a little more gentle, but still you get the sense of the priestly figure wrapped in total, sort of as if it were a cobra or a, boa constrictor, all wrapped around him. Okay, so this is Cortez being greeted with open arms and flowers and gifts by the Aztec people, because, and a story that I'm sure you are familiar with, but the irony that the return of Quetzalcoatl was prophesied to occur in the year one reed. Every year has a name, and the year one reed came, and it was 1519 in our calendar system, and the ships of the conquistadors appeared over the horizon, and Cortez, with his horses, which of course they had never seen, with guns, cannon, pale-skinned, so it was felt that they were the gods, and that Cortez was coming to reclaim his throne, the plumed serpent throne. And Montezuma, who was the king of the Aztecs, welcomed him into the city and essentially said, we've been waiting for you for centuries, and now, as it has prophesied, you have returned to what turned out to be the chaos of battle and the destruction of a civilization. I think it's important, though, to remind ourselves that it wasn't only the conquistadors who overcame the Aztec, but when Cortez was marching into the city, he gathered up the people from all of the surrounding city-states in a sort of circle around Tenochtitlan, who had been in a tribute relationship with the Aztecs and who had very hostile feelings toward them. So in fact, it was several hundred conquistadors and maybe 10 to 15,000 people of Mexico, of the Tlaxcalans especially, who are a state that was adjoining Mexico, the Mexica state. So it wasn't just the conquistadors that overcame the Aztecs. But in any case, the next 300 years in a religious sense, the next 300 years were devoted to, as I mentioned earlier, an attempt to convert the native people to Catholicism after the conquest of the culture from a military point of view. And interestingly enough, this is where I first really became convinced of the power of Quetzalcoatl, because so many of the writings of the priestly missionaries are denying the existence of Quetzalcoatl. And they talk a lot about, as if they're addressing the people, and they say, well, we know you had this belief, and we know you had this myth of this sacred figure who brought your people culture and then disappeared and vowed to come back one day. Of course, this is a myth and this is not true, and we are here to convince you, to convert you to our way of religious thinking. And it's by the vehemence of the denial of the myth in the writings of the Spanish missionaries that we know how powerful it really was in the indigenous culture. I'm sure you recognize the Virgin of Guadalupe. But it's not as well known that even the Virgin of Guadalupe has her own identity conflated with the plumed serpent. And I just want to see if I can read this page where I talk about this, but if not, I can tell you what it is. The name Guadalupe is really not related to any specific location in Mexico. It is really a corruption of an Aztec word, a Nahua, which is the Aztec language word, Coatlocpia. Coatlocpia, which means protective serpent goddess. And it is thought that to some degree and on some level, the identity of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who is, of course, the major saint of Mexico, is in her, shall we say, in her earliest identity, in some way, a relative of Quetzalcoatl. Emiliano Zapata. This is, of course, the great portrait by Siqueiros in the Hirshhorn Museum. And Octavio Paz, who's of course one of the most important, at least in my work, one of the most important scholars of Mexican history, wrote of the sense in which all of the heroes, in some way, Octavio Paz says, all of the heroes of Mexico are translations of Quetzalcoatl. By that, he means that in the terms of Zapata, the hero of the revolution, the same sort of sense in which he came to deliver his own people. He spoke to them in their language. He was from Morelos province, but he spoke to the people in the Nahua language, and many of his speeches were transcribed in that language. He was martyred. It is thought that his white horse could be seen on the hillside after he died, as if he had returned, and he was venerated, and his memory is still cherished. In that way, that his identity as a hero was a projection of Quetzalcoatl in a later identity, a later incarnation. Now, we were talking about Diego Rivera before, and the artist who painted these incredible murals here in this building, I gather, was a colleague or a student of Rivera. And you can see the stylistic, not so much in this particular one, but I was struck by the stylistic similarities. Although it's true that Rivera's work is much more ideological and much more message-oriented. I think that's really true. This painting, this mural is in the National Palace in Mexico City, which is, when you're facing the cathedral in the Zocalo, it would be to your right. It's, as you're looking at the side of the cathedral. And you walk in and you go up the staircase. This is a staircase you see toward the second floor, and actually the entire second floor surrounding the courtyard is filled with a series of murals that Rivera actually never finished. He was going to do a series on the entire history of Mexico from pre-Columbian times to the present day. And in the early to mid 1920s, he did this painting on the story of Quetzalcoatl, and you can see him there in the middle. Notice his fair skin. and his beard. He's presiding over his people, and up in the sky you see the different phases, as we've talked about last half hour, the different phases of his myth, including, to the right, his departure on the raft of serpents. And he's wearing his special headdress and his cloak and his special shield, and he's departing toward the east to become the morning star and the evening star. Now, at Dartmouth College, up in New Hampshire, Jose Clemente Orozco was artist in residence there in the mid-1930s, and he had his own interpretation of the Quetzalcoatl myth, and I just selected one panel of his great work, which actually goes all around the entire four walls of the reserve reading room in the Baker Library at Dartmouth, which is downstairs as opposed to being upstairs for Rivera's work. And again, you see how he's depicting Quetzalcoatl with his robe and his beard. In this case, though, almost in a state of shock or dismay. This is the panel right before the departure of Quetzalcoatl, which is over here, like where I'm standing. It continues on. And those two pyramids, I'm pretty sure that's the Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan, the two major structures of Teotihuacan. And his own temple, of course, was there, the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. Now, this painting by David Alfaro Siqueiros shows Cuauhtemoc. Cuauhtemoc was the cousin of Montezuma, and after Montezuma died or was killed, depending on your opinion of the story, he either was killed by the Spaniards or not. But in any case, Cuauhtemoc was his successor, his cousin, and he assumed the throne after his death, and then he, in turn, was tortured by the Spanish. But the interesting thing about this painting, which is from 1944, and which is in Mexico City, is in the lower right-hand corner is that same exact plume serpent from Teotihuacan that we saw earlier. And I think that Siqueiros is just reminding us that despite the conflict and the strife, the myth and the story of the plume serpent persists. And that's sort of the message that you're going to get in the next few works that we're looking at. This is in the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City by Rufino Tamayo. Nacimiento de Nuestra Nacionalidad. And this is from the 1950s. This is a much more abstract version, but I don't know if you can discern the face of Quetzalcoatl, his beard, and his sort of avenging hand stretching out. And if you look down at the ground, you can see the fragments of the serpent ruins in sort of fragments lying at his feet as he's flying over the temple region. Birth of Our Nationality is the title in English. The Birth of Our Nationality. And finally, just in my little mini survey of some of the iconography you can still see in Mexico City, this is by Raul Anguiano, and it's called Mexican Labor and Commerce, and it was commissioned by the, it's in the Chamber of Commerce, I think, in Mexico City. It was painted in 1956. And we're returning full circle. Remember I told you to keep in mind the sprouts of the maize plant, and I hope you can see in the hands of the Indian woman who is sitting beneath the roots of the tree of life, the sprouts of corn, which is the beginning of all life. And at the other end, at the highest reaches of the tree of life, you see the head of Quetzalcoatl thrusting out toward the heavens. In Puebla today, they still celebrate the dance of the Quetzales. I don't think these headdresses, I think are, they're not actually made from the feathers of the Quetzal, but they are kind of paper, or, you know, a heavy, very thick paper woven into a shape to resemble the tail of the Quetzal bird. And this celebration, annual celebration, venerates the story. In the Codex Florentino, there are several pictures of Quetzalcoatl in his penitent role. Remember we talked about the weeping god, and you see Quetzalcoatl engaged in a kind of self-sacrifice, piercing his limbs with the spine of the cactus plant and drawing blood from himself, from his own body, sort of doing penance for the tragedy of his people. And yet, to conclude, I prefer to leave you with the image of Plumed Serpent in his more heroic role, with his very special shield, his plumed cape, his sandals, his plumed helmet, his sacred staff, and his vision of the future in a more positive way for Mexico. Thank you. We could take a few questions, unless everyone's totally overwhelmed, which I hope they're not, because you know what they say, if you give a talk and there are no questions, then you've failed to deliver your message. So, yes, a question.
Cortez came, and he was white and bearded and that. I don't know if I caught, did Quetzalcoatl appear before that time as a white god, or when did, and then that later painting, it certainly showed him as a white god. Was that before Cortez came, or did that come in as they thought Cortez was? I mean, was he always white, or was this something from?
This was something that, well, this is a great question to start out with, and we could do a whole other evening on the problem of accuracy and the problem of finding out where the truth is in this story, truth in quotes. And that's because, let me put it this way, there are there is a debate on the actual number, but there's somewhere around 20 or maybe 17 to 20 books that pre-exist the conquest that survived, sacred codices that preceded the conquest. The rest of them were recreations or retellings of stories from the oral history by people who had survived that period, that were elders by the time their stories were taken, or that were repainted from memory based upon the knowledge that pre-existed the conquest. So it's very hard to know what elements of the story that I've just told you are elaborations or distortions or smoothings over or different versions than the originals. There's an entire discipline of scholarship in Mexico, which I found very interesting, which questions every interpretation that was written down after the conquest as being in some way not polluted, that's too strong a word, but subjective, or distorted in some way by the sensibility of the person who was writing it down. You know, it's like when I was writing my book on Thomas Edison, just to be surrealistic and talk about Thomas Edison for a second. But when I was writing my book on Thomas Edison, I used the oral history archives at Columbia University, and which is this gigantic library of transcriptions of interviews with people that knew Thomas Edison, sort of the same thing. And that's when it hit me that oral history is only as pure and uncompromising as the sensibility of the person who's taking the history. So that's just by long-winded way of answering your question. I feel that the pale skin, the pale complexion of Quetzalcoatl in these late murals is something that, from what at least from what Diego Rivera himself said and what the other artists said, was a way of distinguishing him in terms of shock value from the people that were there already. But whether he truly had pale skin, truly had a beard, I don't think we could ever know the answer to that. Another question? In the front, yes.
Did you, in your travels, run into the theory that Quetzalcoatl might have been a Viking? Which would account for the beard.
I ran into a lot of there's a whole, I guess, from a scholarly point of view, and I don't mean that in a snobby, elitist way. I hope that I haven't come across that way, but I don't. There's a whole. I would prefer to take that as there's a whole other school of thought about how the civilizations in Mexico were established. And there's one theory, which is basically the overland theory, that the Bering Strait, 12,000 years ago, which has now been pushed back to 22,000 years ago, that was one land mass, and the migration pattern was from, where Russia, China, that part of the world, and people came over the Bering Straits and migrated down the western side and left the Clovis points that have been discovered, which are the sort of evidence of this trail. And that's sort of one school of thought. The other school of thought, which has actually just come up again, is that there was a water migration over water of some kind, which would explain why they found recently, I think it was in South America, it was in Peru or Ecuador, a campfire that was 20,000 years old or 25,000 years old. I mean, the remains of it. And there was no way to explain that except that if there was some sort of other way of getting there than traveling gradually across land. So I think that somewhere along the line, the Viking theory is really another way of saying perhaps it was over the water that the people first came. Yes?
This is related with my question. You are talking about the myth from Quetzalcoatl all around Mexico, Mesoamerica, even in the Maya culture. Do you find something like this in the Quechua culture, in Peru, in Inca culture?
Yes, I had, I'm not casting aspersions on my publisher because they did a great job, Public Affairs, they did a wonderful job on the book. At a certain point, I had had a page, about a page in my manuscript about Peru. The Quechua, that's what you're talking about, right? And we talked about it a lot because it was the one place in the book where I went outside my parameters. I was being very, very strict about my time and geography parameters. That's why I have a map at the beginning of the book of basically Mesoamerica. And so we sort of decided to leave that part out because I said, well, if I get involved in that culture and I get into the extensions of Quetzalcoatl up in this country, which is also another story, and the Anasazi and the Four Corners and the mound builders. There's a theory that the mound building culture is in some way related because the mound is really the serpent, the earth serpent. So in that case, it might even be related. So we just decided, you had two choices, either write a book that was 3 times as long or just stick with my parameters. So yes, there's a relationship, and no, I didn't get into it in the book because we made an editorial decision not to. Yes, in the back.
You talk about this herb version of Quetzalcoatl with certain powers, but what did the myth mean? What was the god offering? Is this food, fertility? I'm expecting a myth to come with powers of some sort, and did the powers change over time? Became the evening star and the morning star, but was this god or myth bringing?
Well, the reason I started with the corn, the maize, is because usually when you read about, I found, and I read everything I could get my hands on about this story, obviously. I found that it was very tilted or skewed toward the Aztec phase of the myth, which is understandable because that's the civilization that had the last major confrontation with the conquistador, and so that's the culture that we often find ourselves talking about more frequently. But when you push the story back to its primordial period and try to find the roots for it in a time, as I say in the book, the time, before there was organized religion, before there was priesthood, before there were even names of countries or cities or villages, then you get into an area where you can make an easier connection between Quetzalcoatl as the bringer of culture as a whole. And I think if I had to, you know, make one overall determination, I would say I would see him as the life bringer, as I said in my remarks, and by life I mean not just man, but the whole concept of culture, the whole idea of identity of a culture, which in a way is one of the primary questions that Mexico is still asking itself now. Who are we, and what does it mean? What does it mean to be Mexican? What is, and I think you can connect that to the whole sense of identity that comes with Quetzalcoatl. That would be my very broad answer to that.
Neil Baldwin is not only an author, he's also executive director of the National Book Foundation, which sponsors the National Book Awards. His latest book, Legends of the Plumed Serpent, is published by Public Affairs, 250 West 57th Street, Suite 1825, New York, New York, 10107. You can read a review of this book in this weekend's New York Times Book Review. Mr. Baldwin's other books include Edison, Inventing the Century, and Man Ray, American Artist.